So my OCs were big. I wanted them as tall as their male counterparts and muscular. I wanted a reason for their mass, so they were strong, in an appealing sort of way, of course, not so much in a female bodybuilder kind of way. They were confident, and their presence usually contributed influentially to saving the day or altering the course of events. My characters had sway over others and were respected for their intelligence and fighting skills. Essentially, I was envisioning myself in the body of a Victoria's Secret angel on the super serum from Captain America, with a voice a tad higher, because I sounded like a man, complemented by an expert knowledge of martial arts and medieval warfare. They could usually shapeshift too, because that was awesome. And don't laugh, because if you were honest, what does the imagined version of yourself really look like? My first OC was a centaur, named Centauria, that I dropped into Lord of the Rings because I always felt very strongly that centaurs deserved to be in the text. She was going to be an essential part in destroying Sauron, and would probably fall in love with Legolas, because he was one of the few remaining bachelors, or some random new character of my own invention. The new participants I created improved somewhat over the years. For one, I worked a little harder on developing names. Secondly, they weren't so angsty, though they seemed to get hurt an awful lot, because who didn't love a good rescue scene? And they weren't as muscly as badass, though they could definitely take care of business. Above all, I strove to make them unique and absolutely appealing, or at least that's how I wanted them to come across. As I got older, my fanfiction started to change. I was less concerned with being a part of my favorite fantasy epic as much as I was with romance. Around age 14, falling in love topped my priority list. I was that quiet, bookish kid. I wasn't particularly socially awkward, but I liked being alone, and hanging out with others seemed exhausting. So I spent a lot of time reading, writing, and working on the farm. This also meant that the odds for any real romantic entanglements seemed, well, slim to none. By the time I started college, at the tender age of 14, this hadn't exactly changed, as every male around me was several years older, with different things on his mind. My writing adopted an alternate goal, finding myself true love, in a fictional sense anyway. I stopped matching my original characters with the canon characters of my literary passions. I felt like I couldn't avoid dramatically altering the plot, which I eventually didn't like to do. These were, after all, my favorite stories to begin with. I didn't want my characters to shake things up so much, as I wanted them to feel as a natural missing cast member. I started creating stories that centered around my OC character to represent myself, and another to represent my dream soulmate. He was more difficult to craft. It was easy to make a representative for myself. I knew myself pretty well. But an idealized romantic mate, that was the stuff made purely a fantasy. To top it off, my ideal was sort of bogged down by too many other references. Mr. Darcy, anyone? How about Mr. Rochester, Han Solo, Gilbert Blythe, Laurie, Clark Kent, both the Christopher Reeves, Brandon Routh, and Tom Welling editions, among a whole host of other film, TV, and literary stars contributing to this garbled, burgeoning, muscly, shining Adonis of sexiness meant to represent what I hoped Mr. Wright might encompass. And each subsequent OC I made to represent him depicted qualities I hope he might embody. It was a lot of pressure for any solitary character to hold up. So I started to let them bleed over into my reality. I acted my fantasies out. It was my new form of make-believe, constantly running through my head whenever I was alone. Doing chores, homework, riding, driving, working, eating, doing dishes, falling asleep, fixing fences. I pretended to be any one of my main characters doing just about anything. And bam! A new story would appear in my mind, and, knowing I didn't have the time to keep generating and completing new stories, I would just act them out to compensate. I'd be curled up in bed, pretending I had just succumbed to a near-fatal blow, and the hero comes to the rescue. Or I'd be in my barn, mucking stalls, and pretending I was the standoff stubborn sister of some main character of a show where my value, beauty, and work ethic were recognized and instantly deemed attractive by suitable co-workers. It wasn't a bad way to pass through my teenage years. even if every boyfriend I ever made tended to be made up. Details. It was a way to manifest my fantasies into a version of reality, and I was, still am, very much enthusiastic about the process. Otherwise, my only opportunity was Halloween. Halloween was always that border holiday in my house, especially when we were younger. It was always will it be banned, won't it be banned? We waited anxiously every year to see if the costume designer side of my mother would appear, or if we'd be watching saint movies instead of trick-or-treating. The latter never occurred, but it was always a deep-set fear of mine. Mother has always battled a love-hate relationship with Halloween. We are Roman Catholic, and the horrors encouraged by a pagan holiday disgusted her, though not enough to forbid us to participate, though there were years she threatened to. As a consequence, she strove to put a positive spin on a potentially gory holiday, and our costumes, annually thrown together in the hours before dusk, followed one of three patterns: saint-themed, to compensate; honor-themed, to thank public servers or historical figures, like soldiers, firefighters, or policemen, etc., or family-themed, in which all of us, ranging from 4 to 12 participants depending on the year, dressed up together. This last theme varied. One year we were all Egyptians. Another we were the Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie. Later, some fantasy elements weaseled their way in as an homage to literary or movie characters. This continued till, most recently, my mother's strong opinions on the subject more or less weakened. My younger brother was an unprecedented vampire last year, and once my parents even delighted us by dressing in drag. I miss the fantasy, the genuine spirit of pretending you were someone or something else without the intention of getting laid. This spurred the purchase of my elf ears, replica in the fashion of Lord of the Rings, by a real costume prosthetics company. This past Halloween, I even wore my elf ears to work. I tutored during the day and had classes at night. And I was sort of sneaky about it. I wore regular clothes, mostly because I lacked any aspect of the costume, and my Arwen Evenstar necklace, which I was counting on Tolkien fans to recognize. Most didn't. Actually, very few people commented on my ears at all. In an age where surgery makes just about anything possible, maybe they were just being polite. But my heart swelled when someone did finally acknowledge me. When I bought lunch, a cashier offered me a guileless, nice ears that set my heart apace. I could almost envision blood pounding in my flesh-colored prosthetic tips. The cashier, well-meaning, had probably meant this compliment along the lines of nice costume or great prosthetics. But what if I was indeed an elf? Perhaps someone had really paid me a really nice compliment, like, those are some fine ears. That thrill of someone permitting, accepting, and even encouraging my fantasies was intoxicating. I have been merging fantasy and reality for as long as I can remember. I sort of just wished Halloween wasn't the only day it was acceptable. I'd like to say I've got a better grip on reality, but this is not strictly true. I'm working on growing up. I'm in graduate school, and I attempt to plot out some tentative future for myself. But I spend every evening acting out scenes from fan fictions or original stories that I have written, will, and will never write. Menacing entrances to packed throne rooms, epic sword fights with dastardly villains, steamy romances with unbelievable heroes, thunderous gallops across wild plains, machine gun fights in deserted streets, exquisite balls in just about any time period in England. There are nights when I can't sleep without acting at least one. Sometimes I'm so excited to play out a part that I can't wait to sneak off to bed at night. I mean, regardless of my own interests, tendencies, or history, doesn't everyone on some level participate? I play many roles: student, waitress, tutor, friend, sister, daughter, niece, aunt, granddaughter, geek, computer whiz, artist, writer, rider, glamazon, quirk, nerd, historian, romantic, skeptic, critic, and who knows what else. Every day I have to choose the role or identity I will assume for any given length of time. Isn't that, in some small way, the sort of make-believe everyone participates in? In the long run, immersing myself in my fantasies works out pretty well. I've come up with a few fairly decent stories to date, and I haven't run out of any ideas for new ones. The make-believe of my childhood, fan-fiction craze of my teens, and the fantasies of my adulthood have all shaped the person and the writer I am today. Creative writing, I feel, is something I've always known I wanted to pursue. Honestly, I have some epic dreams. And creative writing is not, after all, a terrible profession to choose.